Think about this honestly. What really happens to most men after they get married? For many, their circle of friends begins to shrink or even vanish entirely. Their hobbies, once a source of personal joy, slowly start to feel like indulgences, unless they directly benefit the family unit. Over time, even their leisure hours are quietly consumed by household tasks and endless family obligations. And what about finances? A man's money, once his own, slowly morphs into our money often. With the woman in control of how it gets allocated or spent? Is this a coincidence? Not at all. It's happening with deliberate precision. Women, whether consciously or instinctively, seem to understand a core truth. A man's value to the family grows when his options outside of it fade away. The fewer external paths he has, the more effort and resources he'll commit to preserving the relationship. So what happens? Step by step, decision by decision, the man's independent life is methodically dismantled. His autonomy erodes until he's trapped both mentally and financially. And what's truly remarkable, almost insidious, is that the very values that define him become the tools of his own confinement. His inner drive to be a loyal husband, a steady provider, a loving father, these noble intentions turn into invisible chains he doesn't resist, because doing so feels selfish, even irresponsible. After all, isn't sacrifice part of being a good man? Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But for many married men, the greater terror is realizing just how thoroughly they've been tamed. Look at the language we casually use: ball and chain, getting hitched, taking the plunge. Doesn't it say something that even our everyday expressions reflect an underlying truth? That marriage often symbolizes a loss of freedom rather than the formation of an equal partnership. But here's where the reality deepens and darkens. This system doesn't merely take advantage of men. It's cleverly designed to make them grateful for the very structure that exploits them. Take the phrase, happy wife, happy life. It's not just homespun. Advise it's a form of psychological conditioning. It teaches men to constantly prioritize their partner's emotional state, while suppressing their own needs, dreams, and well-being. This creates a lopsided dynamic where one person's happiness becomes a permanent goal in the other's. Joy becomes a conditional reward for maintaining that goal. Is that really partnership? Or is it servitude with better PR? Arthur Schopenhauer observed that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. And therein lies the quiet tragedy of marriage. For many men, it gradually eliminates the solitude and freedom that once allowed them to stay true to who they are. Instead, they slowly become a reflection of what their wives want them to be, and it doesn't happen all at once. The transformation creeps in, quietly. He skips guy's night just to keep the peace. He chooses her favorite restaurant not because he wants to, but to avoid an argument. He lets her make the social plans to minimize friction. Each of these choices feels minor, even reasonable, on its own, but taken together, they form a slow, silent surrender of personal agency. Meanwhile, women's behavior in marriage follows a predictable pattern that reveals the underlying biological programming. In the early days, the courtship phase, they put their best foot forward. They're affectionate, highly agreeable, sexually available, and seem to take genuine interest in the man's world. Shared hobbies, spontaneous intimacy, lighthearted conversations, these create the illusion of deep compatibility. Demands are low, appreciation is high, and everything feels effortless. But once the commitment is secured, be it through marriage, children, or cohabitation, the dynamic begins to shift. Gradually, and often subtly, the original behaviors start to fade. Sexual intimacy, once frequent and passionate, becomes conditional, a bargaining chip, instead of an act of genuine desire. Shared interests suddenly take a backseat unless they serve a larger family-related purpose. The number of demands increases, while the level of agreeability noticeably drops. The woman who was once eager to please becomes entitled to be pleased. This isn't about conscious manipulation or ill intent. Rather, it's a manifestation of evolutionary programming that's deeply embedded. Women are biologically predisposed to seek commitment and long-term resources. Once these are secured, the focus shifts to optimizing the arrangement for her benefit emotionally, materially, and socially. Men who fail to recognize this biological framework often become unwitting victims of it. And this leads us to a painful truth that many men refuse to accept. Your wife's love is fundamentally conditional. It's anchored not in your essence as a human being, but in your ability to provide emotionally, financially, and physically. The moment you falter, be it through job loss, illness, or simply becoming too familiar and predictable, that love starts to wane. Not always in an explosive moment, but often in quiet disconnection. Need proof? Just look at the divorce data. Women initiate between 70 to 80% of divorces. Why? Not necessarily because they're deeply unhappy, but because they've concluded, often rationally, that they can secure better terms elsewhere because they've already extracted what they perceive as maximum value from the current relationship. They don't leave at rock bottom. They leave when the cost-benefit ratio tilts in their favor. The family court system reinforces this dynamic by ensuring that, even after divorce, the man remains financially tethered. Alimony, child support, asset division, all serve as mechanisms to continue the resource extraction long after the emotional bond has dissolved, and the damage doesn't stop at finances. Here's where it becomes psychological warfare. Modern marriage doesn't just exploit men economically, it gradually dismantles their mental framework. It chips away at identity, autonomy, and purpose. Over time, the married man the idea that his thoughts, emotions, and desires are secondary. His primary role becomes maintaining peace, solving problems, and carrying the emotional load often alone. He reacts more than he initiates. He fixes rather than feels, adapts. Instead of asserting, this breeds a mental state psychologists refer to as learned helplessness, where repeated exposure to stressors outside one's control leads to passivity and surrender. He stops expressing his needs, not because he doesn't have them, but because experience has shown that doing so creates conflict, not resolution. Eventually, he develops what can only be described as a form of domestic Stockholm syndrome, identifying with the very system that exploits him. He defends it, rationalizes it, even promotes it to others, convinced that his suffering is simply the price of being a good man. He tells himself that sacrifice equals love, that discomfort is a necessary part of being a man, and that expressing his needs would somehow make him weak or selfish. The narrative is deeply embedded. Real men put their families first, no matter what it costs them personally. But what if that sacrifice, so often celebrated, is actually a quiet surrender of self? The most insidious part of this psychological conditioning is how powerfully it's reinforced by the world around him. Popular media glorifies the devoted family man, the stoic father figure who works tirelessly, asks for nothing, and gives everything for his wife and children. He's portrayed as noble, even heroic. Religion echoes this message, preaching that true masculinity is rooted in selflessness. Men are told to love their wives as Christ loved the church, metaphor for complete and total sacrifice, and it doesn't stop there. Even other men, often too broken to admit it, become enforcers of the same system. Why? Because acknowledging the harsh reality of their own experience would mean confronting their psychological defeat. So they smile through the struggle, repeating the myth that marriage is a partnership, while inwardly living a very different truth, one of quiet servitude and emotional suppression. If you're recognizing these patterns in your own life or relationships, if this message feels uncomfortably familiar, it's not a coincidence. You're not alone. You're not imagining things. That gut feeling you've been pushing aside may be the first step toward reclaiming clarity. If this analysis is bringing light to uncomfortable truths about modern marriage, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps this conversation grow and spread. It ensures these hard but necessary insights reach the men who desperately need to hear them. The algorithms respond to your actions, and your participation isn't just digital, it's cultural. It signals that these unspoken dynamics matter. that male psychological well-being deserves space in the conversation. The tragedy isn't that women exploit these dynamics. The real tragedy is that men are completely unprepared for them. From a young age, boys are taught to protect others, but never taught how to protect themselves from emotional and psychological erosion, especially from those they're trying to protect. They're told to be warriors, but never warned that the battlefield might be their own home. Here's what no one tells young men about marriage. The moment you make a woman your primary source of happiness, validation, and meaning, you've already lost. You've given away your psychological sovereignty to someone whose evolutionary programming was never designed to prioritize your inner world. That doesn't make her malicious, it makes her female. Her behavior, often puzzling to men, isn't chaotic. It follows predictable patterns, shaped by millions of years of survival-based evolution. The women who are best at extracting resources from men, emotional, financial, or physical were the ones who survived and passed on their genes. The result? Women today are hardwired not for your emotional fulfillment, but for their own security and advantage. Evolution didn't prepare women to nurture a man's sense of identity or ensure his psychological peace. It prepared them to secure survival and reproductive success. And now, modern marriage gives them powerful legal and cultural tools to pursue those goals with stunning efficiency and very little resistance. The man who understands this truth stops taking female behavior personally. He begins responding logically, not emotionally. He doesn't hate women. He simply stops placing blind trust in an outdated ideal. He recognizes that marriage is not about love. It's about leverage. And leverage, in every relationship, belongs to the person with the most options, Schopenhauer wrote. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative, only and never positive. He understood a timeless truth that contentment doesn't come from controlling others or relying on them for meaning. It comes from not needing anything outside yourself to feel complete. This understanding shatters the core illusion of modern marriage, the illusion that happiness lies in shared goals, emotional unity, or long-term partnership. When a man stops chasing completion through someone else, he begins to reclaim his power. The man who needs marriage to feel fulfilled has already surrendered his power. The man who sees it as an optional addition, not a requirement, is the one who retains his autonomy. This isn't just a philosophical observation, it's a psychological truth. The man who enters marriage from a place of emotional dependence has already relinquished control over his own sense of identity. In contrast, the man who understands that his life is complete with or without a wife, that fulfillment is something he builds internally, remains sovereign, keeps his sense of self intact regardless of external commitments. But here's where most men make their fatal error. They assume that these deeply ingrained relationship dynamics can be negotiated or rebalanced through sheer effort. They think if they just improve themselves, become better communicators, earn more money, show more emotional availability, they can shift the power in their favor. It's a comforting illusion. But tragically, it's also false, trying to reverse these dynamics through better behavior is like trying to bargain with gravity. You're not facing conscious intent. You're dealing with biological imperatives, instincts etched into human nature over millions of years. These behaviors aren't choices women actively make, just as men don't consciously choose to be attracted to youth and fertility. Women don't deliberately strategize to extract maximum benefit. It's subconscious. It's structural. It's evolutionary. The only winning move is not to play by rules that guarantee your defeat the moment you engage within a system rigged against you, believing effort will somehow override nature you've already lost. And here's the part that successful men know deep down, yet rarely if ever say out loud: the moment you become indispensable to a woman's lifestyle, you become dispensable as a man. She stops seeing you as a person. We're no longer a whole being with dreams, ambitions, and emotional needs. You become a role of function, a provider of resources, a stabilizer of emotions, a solver of problems. The transformation is subtle, gradual, and devastating. What may appear from the outside to be a healthy marriage is often nothing more than sophisticated servitude. Masked by occasional intimacy and emotional crumbs, the man gives labor, money, energy, and in return, the woman manages domestic logistics while controlling the flow of affection and sex. It's a system that may function with efficiency, but it lacks genuine partnership. It lacks mutual recognition of personhood. The psychological consequences of this arrangement are not theoretical, they're measurable. Married men, statistically, live shorter lives. They experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. They slowly fade into muted versions of themselves, haunted by the gap between what they hoped marriage would be and what it actually became. They are not simply burdened by adult responsibilities, they're burdened by chronic psychological exploitation, camouflaged as duty, devotion, and love. And here lies the cruel irony: society refuses to acknowledge this reality. Why? Because our entire cultural and economic infrastructure relies on male sacrifice. A system that demands men give up personal fulfillment in service of family and work community cannot afford to let them question that duty. The man who begins to prioritize his own well-being over the traditional role of selfless husband and father poses a threat to this social order. That's why the moment a man dares to question marriage, to see through the illusion, he's swiftly labeled selfish, immature, commitment-phobic. These aren't objective critiques. They are tools of social control. Shame becomes the leash that pulls men back into line. The system cannot survive honest scrutiny, so it punishes those who think critically. It distracts them with moral language while hiding transactional realities. But here is where Schopenhauer's insight becomes not just philosophical, but revolutionary. He wrote, "The safest way of not being very miserable is not to expect to be very happy." Applied to modern relationships, this means liberation through clarity. Don't expect marriage to be a wellspring of joy, emotional security, or unconditional love. Don't enter it with the illusion that it will fix you or complete you, because when you release these expectations, you eliminate the crushing disappointment that erodes so many men from the inside out. You protect your peace not by withdrawing from life, but by refusing to build your identity on fantasies that were never designed for your fulfillment in the first place. You start evaluating marriage like any other contract, based on terms, costs, and benefits, rather than relying on emotions or blindly following social expectations. You step back and begin asking the difficult but necessary questions. What exactly am I receiving from this arrangement? What specifically am I giving up? And in the end, is this trade-off truly aligned with my long-term interests and goals? Men, unfortunately, never reach this point of clarity. They've been conditioned since childhood to believe that love is supposed to be unconditional, it's magical, and above practical analysis. That asking such questions somehow taints the purity of romance. But here's the inconvenient truth. Love fades, emotions fluctuate, and human needs evolve over time. Despite this natural progression, the marriage contract remains legally and socially binding, regardless of how either party feels months or years later. The man who enters relationships strategically instead of emotionally preserves his personal power throughout the interaction, doesn't give up his freedom in exchange for promises of loyalty, doesn't erase his individuality hoping to be admired or rewarded for his selflessness. He doesn't transfer responsibility for his happiness onto someone else, only to resent them later. When they inevitably fail to meet his ever-shifting emotional needs, this approach requires a subtle but profound shift in thinking and mindset, rooted in what Schopenhauer called the art of not being deceived. It means developing the ability to distinguish between words and actions, between what women say they want and what they actually respond to. For instance, women often say they value emotional openness and sensitivity in men. They claim to desire someone who listens, who validates their feelings, who prioritizes their void. Emotional well-being, but observe real behavior instead of slogans. Who do they chase? Who captures their sustained interest? Consistently, it's the man who remains grounded in his mission, the man who respects himself first, the one who maintains emotional independence. Look at how women interact with men in their own social circles. the guy who immediately drops everything to accommodate her. He becomes invisible, taken for granted.
Ow.
The one who's unavailable at times because he's focused on meaningful goals. He becomes intriguing. The man who constantly seeks her approval and input on every decision, he quickly loses her respect. But the man who makes firm decisions and simply invites her to be part of his journey, he keeps her interest. This isn't some grand scheme of manipulation. Women aren't being deceitful on purpose. They truly believe. They want the traits they describe, but their deeper, unconscious programming responds to different self-sufficiency, purpose, self-sufficiency. They are drawn to mystery, tested by emotional distance, and repelled by excessive predictability. Yet ironically, they will often shame men for displaying these exact qualities, calling them emotionally unavailable, selfish, or arrogant, especially when their immediate emotional needs aren't being met. The modern man must learn to navigate this contradiction with awareness, because what women consciously believe they want often clashes with what their subconscious mind actually finds compelling. That's why listening only to what women say is insufficient. To truly understand attraction and respect, a man must observe how women behave, what patterns emerge, what behaviors they reward, and where their attention naturally gravitates. Instead, he builds a life so compelling that partnership becomes optional rather than necessary. He doesn't rely on a woman to provide meaning, doesn't chase connection to fill a void. He immerses himself in purposes so strong, so deeply fulfilling that a partner must genuinely elevate his life, not simply patch emotional holes. He becomes so comfortable in solitude. It's a hole within himself that companionship must earn its place. This is not emotional detachment, it's psychological strength. And in a world where dependence is common, this level of self-possession is rare. That rarity makes it profoundly attractive. This psychological independence is attractive, precisely because it's rare. Most men are so desperate for validation and connection that they'll accept almost any terms to get it. They abandon their standards, sacrifice their priorities, and compromise their sense of self in exchange for fleeting attention or affection. It's a dangerous trade, one that costs far more than it delivers. This kind of desperation isn't just unattractive, it's repellent. Women can sense it, and their instincts interpret it as weakness. The man who doesn't need anything from others becomes psychologically magnetic. He radiates a quiet power, a calm certainty that draws others in without effort. Why? Because the scarcity principle, a law that governs human attraction operates ruthlessly in romantic dynamics. The more rare something appears, the more valuable it becomes. If you're always available, constantly agreeable, and endlessly accommodating, you send a clear message. Your time is cheap, your options are few, and your value is low, no matter how much a woman might appreciate your kindness or loyalty on a conscious level. Her subconscious attraction mechanisms begin to shut down in response to your neediness. It's not personal, it's biological. Evolution has wired women to respond to strength, not submission. Consider how this dynamic unfolds in today's dating culture. The men who experience the most difficulty are typically those who elevate women to pedestal status from the very first interaction. They respond instantly to messages, enthusiastically agree to any plans, cancel their own commitments to accommodate her, and clearly signal through every action that she is now the center of their universe. Ironically, this overwhelming attention doesn't win her over. It raises red flags. Her instincts kick in. If he's this available, this eager, this pliable, what's the catch? If no other women are vying for his attention, if he seems to have no personal boundaries or higher purpose, what does that say about his worth in the social hierarchy? On the flip side, the men who generate deep, even obsessive attraction are the ones who treat dating as a complement to an already fulfilling life, not the centerpiece of it. They are on a mission that extends far beyond romance. They have personal goals that demand their focus. They set and enforce standards not as a tactic, but because they live with purpose. They don't abandon their schedule or integrity for temporary approval. Women don't consciously decide to be attracted to this type of man. Evolutionary biology makes the decision for them. They become fixated not on the man who showers them with attention, but on the man who is just out of reach. The one who doesn't always text back immediately. The one who seems engaged in something more important when he's not available. The one whose attention feels earned, not given away. This dynamic flips the traditional script. Suddenly she's investing more into the relationship than she's receiving. She starts to chase. She begins to prove herself rather than judge him. This reversal taps directly into her ancient instincts, the deep-rooted patterns that once governed courtship, long before dating apps and social media ever existed. But here's the paradox that confuses and frustrates most men. The less you emotionally need relationships, the better your relationships become. The less you pursue, the more you're pursued. The less emotional energy you pour in up front, the more others become curious, invested, and intrigued. This isn't manipulation. It's not about playing games or being cold. It's simply an expression of one of the oldest truths in human behavior. People value what they perceive as rare. What's common is overlooked. What's abundant is devalued. Your attention, your time, your presence, they become more meaningful when they're earned, not handed out freely. Your attention, time, and emotional investment become more valuable when they're not freely available to everyone. The marriage trap works by convincing men that scarcity is selfish and that unlimited availability proves love. This narrative has been deeply embedded into the male psyche through culture, media, and social conditioning. Men are taught that withholding time or emotional access makes them cold or heartless, while constant accessibility is hailed as devotion. But in truth, unlimited availability doesn't prove love, it proves desperation. And desperation is not a virtue. It's a glaring red flag. Desperation signals a lack of self-respect, of boundaries, of purpose. It reveals a man willing to sacrifice his center to orbit someone else's world. In romantic dynamics, this behavior backfires. Women aren't drawn to it, they recoil from it. Why? Because women's biological programming is designed to test men's psychological strength. These tests often come in the form of subtle emotional pressure, inconsistent signals, or even outright manipulation, not necessarily out of malice, but out of instinct. The man who consistently fails these tests by prioritizing her emotions over his own principles loses her respect and attraction. He becomes emotionally subordinate, seeking approval rather than standing grounded in his own identity. She may not be able to explain it logically, but something within her grows restless. Even repelled the man who passes these tests by maintaining his boundaries and priorities earns her ongoing investment and effort. She doesn't sit down and consciously decide to prefer strength over submission. Her biology makes the decision for her. It's not about cruelty, it's about clarity. It's not about arrogance. It's about anchoring yourself so firmly in your purpose that nothing, not even love, can pull you off course. This is why nice guys finish last. Isn't just a bitter saying, it's a biological law. In the language of evolutionary psychology, niceness often communicates more than just kindness. It broadcasts genetic weakness, emotional dependency, and low mate value. These traits don't stir attraction, they trigger aversion. Women may smile and say thank you, but their instincts are saying run. But here's where most men go tragically wrong. They confuse strength with cruelty and independence with indifference. They believe being selective means being dismissive, or that setting boundaries is a form of control. It's not. The psychologically sovereign man understands the difference. He can be kind without being weak. He can give generously without expecting validation. He can love fully without losing himself in the process. He gives from abundance, not from lack. His energy, time, and affection come from a place of internal wealth, not emotional poverty. That's what makes his presence magnetic, not burdensome. But to reach this level, something must die. The part of you that needs external validation. To feel worthy, must sever your dependence on others to affirm your masculinity, your value, your identity. You must become so grounded, so whole within yourself, that approval becomes a bonus, not a necessity. You must develop purposes so compelling, so consuming, that relationship drama feels trivial by comparison. Picture the man who wakes each morning with a mission burning in his chest. He's not sidetracked by emotional turbulence. He's not derailed by fleeting attention. He is on path, with or without a partner. The journey to this kind of psychological sovereignty is brutal and often lonely. You'll feel the weight of expectation pressing down on you. Society will tell you to compromise, to settle, to shrink. Your vision, in exchange for peace, you'll watch your peers hand over their dreams for comfort, and they'll be applauded for it. But on the other side of that discomfort lies a power few men ever taste: the ability to engage with women from a place of strength, not need. When you need nothing from them, you're finally free to appreciate everything they genuinely offer. There's no resentment for what they can't give. There's no bitterness over unmet fantasies. You can love without attachment, care without controlling, and engage without losing yourself in the process. You are no longer a man seeking to be completed. You are complete, and from that place, you create something real, something rooted in mutual strength rather than shared weakness. This is the difference between relationships built on mutual enhancement versus mutual dependency. The marriage industrial complex survives by convincing men that independence equals loneliness and that sacrifice equals love. This narrative is pushed relentlessly through media, family, and cultural institutions until it becomes internalized truth for many. But let's take a closer look. Independence doesn't equal loneliness. It equals choice. It means autonomy. It means freedom. And sacrifice doesn't equal love. It equals transaction, a trade, an exchange where one gives something up with the hope of getting something in return. Real love enhances both parties without diminishing either. It doesn't demand that you shrink so someone else can shine. It doesn't require compromise at the cost of your identity. Instead, it fuels energy, sparks creativity, and gives rise to a partnership where two complete individuals support each other's growth. It creates energy rather than consuming it. It expands possibilities rather than limiting them. It celebrates individual growth rather than demanding conformity. These types of relationships, however, are extremely rare. Why? Because they require both people to be whole within themselves. They demand inner work, deep reflection, and the courage to face one's own shadows. Most people aren't ready for that. Most people aren't willing to do the inner work required for this level of consciousness. They'd rather settle for comfort than chase truth. They seek validation, not evolution. But for the man who develops this psychological sovereignty, marriage becomes a choice rather than a necessity. He doesn't look to marriage to save him, fix him, or make him whole. He views it as one possible avenue among many, a partnership that must meet his values, standards, and vision. If it adds meaning, he'll engage. If not, he'll walk away. Without fear, he can engage with it if it genuinely enhances his life, or avoid it if the terms don't serve his interests. Either way, he remains free. Schopenhauer's ultimate insight wasn't about the nature of women or marriage. His brilliance lay in something deeper, the understanding that we can rise above our instinctual drives and conditioning. Consciousness allows choice. That once you understand the forces that control most humans, you can choose whether to be controlled by them. And that's the real power. The red pill isn't about becoming bitter or cynical about relationships. It's not an excuse to reject love or connection. It's about developing a relationship with truth so honest, so unflinching, that you can build a life rooted in reality, not illusion. It's about loving truth enough to rebuild your life according to reality rather than comfortable illusions. And when that truth is internalized, everything shifts. You no longer chase relationships hoping they'll complete you. You develop the strength to stand alone so you can choose to stand together. This is the turning point. This is where your real life begins. Not when you receive validation or affection from others, but when you no longer need anything from anyone to be complete. The strong don't avoid relationships because they hate connection. They demand relationships that match their level of psychological development. And in doing so, they radiate a different kind of magnetism, one based on sovereignty, not scarcity. In this state, they no longer attract people who want to consume them, but those rare souls who wish to grow alongside them. And in that philosophical sovereignty, they discover a strength that attracts the rare individuals who actually deserve their presence, not because they crave validation, not because they fear loneliness, but because they choose connection. Not because they are desperate, but because they are abundant. In the end, the choice is yours. You can keep accepting whatever terms the world offers because you're terrified of being alone. Or you can forge a life so rich, so meaningful, so full of purpose, that others are drawn to it, competing for access to something you've built through awareness and courage. One path leads to psychological slavery disguised as love. The other leads to genuine freedom that makes authentic love possible. And the line between them isn't fate or fortune, it's simply your level of consciousness, your courage to live by it. Choose wisely. Your future self depends on it.